The Home Office has no idea how many asylum seekers have gone missing. The Home Office has no data on a third of people who have claimed asylum in the last 3 years. That is tens of thousands of illegal immigrants who could have just vanished.
If 1% of them are Hamas soldiers, England's not going to know what hit.
Over 100,000 people have applied for asylum in the United Kingdom in 2025, and more than 30,000 of them have vanished from the Home Office system. 4 in 10 failed asylum seekers are still living in Britain, while the deportation rate remains in single digits. In just 1 year, £4.9 billion in taxpayer money has been spent, including £2.1 billion on migrant hotels with no effective oversight and no real control. Official data shows that around 1 in every 100 people placed in migrant hotels has been linked to a criminal offence, meaning individuals already flagged for criminal concerns are being housed in open access facilities with no continuous monitoring and no obligation for authorities to know where they are the next day. The problem is not the people who disappeared, but a system that was never designed to enforce accountability. Stay with us, because to understand how things slipped out of control, we need to look directly at how this system was designed. These people did not disappear through chaos or confrontation, but through the quiet gaps built into the system meant to manage them. Once an asylum claim is registered, the state records the name, a date of arrival, and a temporary address, but from that moment on, active tracking largely stops. Migrant hotels operate on trust rather than control. Residents are free to leave at any time with no checkout process and no confirmation of return. When a claim is rejected, the system does not tighten, but steps back. There are no enforcement teams, no urgent action, only letters, notices and waiting. It is in that silence that many slip out of view, not because they broke the system, but because the system allows an exit without consequence. By late afternoon, the facts were clear and the failures undeniable. Nothing changed. No action, no control, only calls for patience, and that was the moment patience ran out. For many, it looked as though public safety had been set aside and people chose the streets over waiting. At 4:47 p.m, there was no announcement and no call to action, but small groups began stopping outside migrant hotels. There were no banners and no leaders, just people who no longer wanted to walk past and look away. By 5:38 p.m, scattered conversations began to merge, driven by the same questions and the same silence from authorities. Numbers grew faster than expected and people did not come and go, they stayed. At 6:12 p.m, the first chants broke out, short, clear and repeated, while police were present but thin, watching more than controlling. As darkness settled around 7:46 p.m, tensions rose, flares were lit, fireworks appeared, phones were raised, and within minutes, what happened on one street was playing out on thousands of screens. By 8:09 p.m, police lines were formed, uneven and stretched, with one vehicle damaged and another forced to retreat. This was no longer symbolic, it had become direct. At 10:27 p.m, official statements urging calm were released, and media coverage described isolated incidents involving small groups. But on the streets, no one believed that anymore. After midnight, the gatherings did not remain in one place. They spread from town to town and from street to street. Not coordinated and not planned, but moving in the same direction. This is what happens when pressure builds faster than the system can respond. By the early hours of the morning, the response began to shift, not on the streets, but in press rooms, prepared statements and behind podiums. The tone was calm, measured and reassuring. The public was urged to remain calm, stay indoors and avoid speculation. There was no admission of failure, no acknowledgement of scale, and no sense of urgency. As morning approached, the language hardened. Ministers condemned disorder, praised police restraint, and repeated familiar lines about balance and tolerance while avoiding the reasons people gathered in the first place. The missing figures were not addressed, the enforcement gap was ignored, and the question of accountability went unanswered. Media coverage followed the same pattern. focusing on clashes rather than causes, damage rather than decisions, and crowd behaviour rather than policy failure. Footage looped and context disappeared. On the ground, the contrast was stark. While statements called for patience, the streets told a different story, and a growing sense took hold that appeals to calm were being used in place of action. By now, the divide was unmistakable between what was being said and what had already happened, and between a system asking for trust and a public that no longer believed waiting would change anything. As daylight neared, one reality became impossible to ignore. The issue was no longer enforcement or capacity, but political choice. After the numbers, the protests, and the official statements, one issue stood above all others: accountability. Decisions are made daily inside government departments that carry real-world risk, yet failure carries no personal cost. Policies are approved, contracts are signed, and facilities are opened. But when outcomes unravel, responsibility dissolves into committees and reviews. With no individual answering for the result and no office bearing consequence for error. This is how risk accumulates unnoticed, not through malice, but through insulation. A system that rewards speed, compliance, and optics, but never tests decisions against outcomes, will always drift away from reality. When accountability is absent, correction never arrives. Problems are managed rather than solved, and each decision becomes easier to repeat regardless of impact. At this stage, the crisis is no longer operational but structural. Every effective system depends on limits, clear thresholds, defined endpoints, and rules that end processes instead of extending them indefinitely. When those limits erode, systems do not collapse suddenly, they expand uncontrollably. Procedures multiply, exceptions generate new exceptions, and reviews trigger further reviews. Each step appears reasonable in isolation, yet together they remove all finality. Nothing concludes, nothing resets, and the system moves forward without ever stopping to assess whether it should. Crucially, this failure does not require exploitation or bad faith. It emerges naturally when safeguards are designed to prevent error, but never to enforce resolution. Over time, complexity replaces clarity, responsibility fragments, decision-making slows, and risk grows. A system without limits cannot protect the public, because it no longer knows where responsibility ends. When systems fail quietly, the cost does not remain abstract. It appears in everyday life as police resources are diverted from routine duties, emergency response times stretch, and local councils absorb pressures they were never designed to manage. Communities adjust without being consulted. This is not about fear, but exposure. Residents are asked to accept uncertainty as normal, to tolerate disruption without explanation, and to trust assurances that no longer align with lived experience. The burden is not shared evenly, and it lands on those closest to the consequences. What makes this failure corrosive is its silence. There is no vote, no warning, and no mechanism for consent. The public does not create the risk, yet they are expected to absorb it. In that moment, trust does not erode loudly, it fades. The most dangerous phase of any crisis is not escalation, but normalization. When barriers and emergency measures stop feeling temporary, statements repeat familiar language, and disruption becomes routine. At that point, failure is no longer questioned but managed. Institutions adapt to dysfunction, metrics are adjusted, expectations are lowered, and stability becomes defined as the absence of collapse rather than the presence of control. Once failure is normalised, reform becomes optional, urgency disappears, and the system survives by enduring error rather than resolving it. History shows this pattern clearly. Societies do not lose order overnight. They acclimate to its absence, and by the time correction is demanded, the mechanisms to deliver it are already weakened. This story is not about migration, but about governance. A system that cannot correct itself will eventually transfer its failures to the public. Accountability is not a moral concept, but a functional one. Without it, policy becomes detached from consequence. The lesson is simple but uncomfortable. Systems designed to avoid responsibility will always drift toward disorder, not because of who enters them, but because of how they operate. When outcomes do not matter to decision makers, outcomes stop improving. Effective governance requires more than rules and funding. It requires ownership, clear responsibility, and the willingness to accept correction when policies fail. Until those conditions exist, crises will repeat, not as anomalies, but as features. Understanding that distinction is the first step toward reform. How do we measure accountability when policies collapse? And why do those decisions always fall on everyday life? Follow our next analyses.